We want to welcome you to ChristPoint Oasis.
Welcome.
You know, there's a lot of things that are really going on in our world.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, we've been watching the news, and I mean, this pandemic thing, wow, it's just like really going up.
And ever growing.
Yeah, and then you're seeing so much controversy when it comes to just relationships, ethnic relationships, and all of that.
Division.
Yeah, it just makes you question, wow, what's going on in this world? You know, definitely not an ideal world right now.
It's definitely not an ideal world.
If you had your opportunity to live in an ideal world, what would it be like?
Well, I think that my definition of what an ideal world would be like is one that equality is shared by all.
Equality. Okay. So that's important to you.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I think it's important to everybody. Everybody wants a fair chance at things. Right. I agree with that. But in order for that to occur, then the powers that are in control has to make sure that that happens. Yeah, they do. And so, you know, I'm so glad that we're a part of a spiritual kingdom where God the Father is in control. Yeah, He is the power that be. He ordains power. It's necessary. You know, a lot of people are giving a hard time to those who are officials and police officers and all of that, but those actually are roles that are ordained by God.
And necessary.
They're necessary. They really are necessary. But anyway, we're going to be talking about power a little bit today, and we just hope that you watch and you find yourself encouraged by the things that we talk about. We're going to have a praise team that's going to be, I mean, they're just awesome. Committed acapella. They're friends of mine from Robbinsville, Alabama. Yeah. And so they're going to be singing a song that's called Everything is Going to Be All Right.
Everything's going to be all right.
I believe it's going to be all right, don't you?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, y'all, God bless.
God bless.
Come on. Look at here, y'all. If you're tired of the devil pressing us down, come on, y'all. Come on, it's time to fight. Well, I know it seems like the devil. Seems like he's winning sometimes. But I came here to let you know that the devil is alive. God is true. God said, no weapon formed against us shall prosper. Come on. Look at your neighbor and say, everything is gonna be all right. Go get your armor. Go get your armor and fight the fight. Go get your helmet, get your sword, and get your shield. It's time to stand. Stand and do God's will. Everything is gonna be okay. Yeah. Look out, the enemy is on his way. Watch out now. Come on. But with God, everything, I came to tell you, you don't have nothing to worry about. Just keep your faith in the Master. I need a witness. Marissa, Philip, come here. Sing.
Everything is gonna be alright. Though your day seems dark as night, Satan's strong, but God is stronger. So keep the faith and you gotta keep pressing on. Everything is gonna be okay. God has promised He will make a way. If God be for us, who can destroy us? Stand tall, the victory is won. What can separate us from God's love? So tribulation on His throne, persecution, nakedness. Oh no, we're more than conquerors on this battlefield. God has never lost a battle, and I know He never will. I'm so bold and I'm ready to go. We gon' tear it down. Said it's up to me, and it's up to you. We're gonna march on.
without faith. Come on, tell them. Go get your shield and come on.
Go get your shield and come on. Well, I'm ready. Yeah. Well, I'm ready.
Go get the word of God, y'all. Come on, go get your sword and come on.
Go get your sword and come on. Well, I'm ready.
Devil, we're not afraid of you anymore. Come on, look the devil in the eye and tell him. Devil, we're ready. Come on.
Devil, we're ready. Come on. Well, I'm ready.
Come on, devil, we're ready for you now.
Well, I'm ready.
Look him in the eye. Tell him. Come on, put it. Come on.
Well, I'm ready.
Oh, they don't hear us committed. Come on. They don't hear what you're saying. Put it together. Come on. Go get your shield and come on.
Go get your shield and come on.
Go get your sword and come on.
Go get your sword and come on.
Devil, we're ready. Come on.
Devil, we're ready. Come on.
Put up your deuce and come on.
Put up your deuce and come on.
Soldiers of Christ are right. Devil is over. The body of Christ. We're coming at you.
Sometimes things have to be crushed in order to be recreated. An aluminum can is often crushed before it's recycled. And a potter will often crush the clay several times in order to reform the vessel. That was true for Israel and Judah because they had become distorted in their perspective and they were deformed in their purpose. The problem of Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, remember they're one people who are divided politically, is that the elite of these nations, especially the nation of Israel, put their trust in their kings whose pride and quest for power was more important than the people and more important than the purposes of God. The politics of these leaders caused them to lose sight of sensitivity, love, justice, equity, and fairness that God wanted them to execute as leaders. In fact, the more power they held, the more callous and sinful they became toward others. And not only did these leaders become corrupt, but their corruption was cancerous because it even affected the community who were being deprived and being denied justice. Those who were being denied, those who were in the community, they were bitter. They had become corrupt even in their everyday practices. God became nothing more than a meaningless memorial when it came to worship. And their acceptance of all the pagan deities only exacerbated God's wrath against them. In fact, God sent messengers to them, prophets to them, to help them. He sent Amos and Micah, Hosea. He even had Hosea to take a wife from the prostitutes to illustrate their adulterous nature in relation to him and how they would follow after these false gods. And he also sent Isaiah. He sent these individuals to them because God is loving. But both Israel and Judah, they were so immersed in the current of idolatry and injustice that their ears were deafened. And they just continued in their way until God sent the Assyrians and the Babylonians to enslave them. I mean, their leaders were so blinded by their own political pursuits that it led to their own destruction. Now it's in this setting that you hear Isaiah speak these words. Isaiah says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. What will you do on the day of reckoning when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your riches? Nothing will remain but to cringe among the captives and fall among the slain. Yet for all of this his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised." I think the salient question in this text is, what will you do? Now in this text we begin to see the dynamics of oppression. In this text Isaiah focuses his address on a specific group of people, and that's those who make these laws. In other words, he's speaking to empowered people. He's speaking to people who are actually empowered by God, because God ordains authority. We see over and over again where God raises up individuals into positions of power. God did that for David. God did that for Solomon. We begin to see him raising up people for that purpose. Romans the 13th chapter in verse 1. We recognize that power is essential, and God places individuals in those positions. That's not the issue, power, because God gave it. So God empowers, but the problem is that people often corrupt the power that's actually been placed in their hands. Samuel begins to talk about this when Israel came to him asking for a king. He said basically what's going to happen is that a king will actually enslave you. In 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, verses 10 through 22, you begin to see a long statement that's made by Samuel, telling all the things that God says a king is going to do. And the last thing that he stated to them is that ultimately he's going to make you slaves and you're going to cry out for me. The problem is not the power, but the policy proceeding from their politics. You see, in the text he says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless." From the question stated in verse 1, we can infer that there's going to be a time of accounting. A time of accounting is going to come. A day of reckoning. Now the Hebrew word is pakuda. And pakuda basically is translated by some texts as punishment, others as oversight, and some would say the day of visitation. But I think reckoning is the better idea, because it describes a time that is actually approaching where individuals have to give an account for their actions. Notice the question is aimed at the guilty and not at those who are being oppressed. I believe the reason is because God is the avenger of the oppressed. But he avenges the oppressed only when the oppressed remains guiltless. You see, actually, if you continue to read, you'll find that even the widows and the fatherless have been influenced by the corruption. In other words, being oppressed is not a license for vengeance, and it's not an excuse for corrupt behavior. Even though it might seem that people are getting away with murder, it doesn't mean that you should join them by excusing your own corrupt behavior. You see, it's possible that a corrupt system can corrupt the disadvantaged. Corruption at the top often leads to corruption at the bottom, or through and through. In fact, Jesus always told his disciples, beware of the leaven of the Pharisee. It was an indication of corruption and its power. But because corruption has a tendency to corrupt, we need to be careful that the system doesn't corrupt us. Let me tell you something. God doesn't use the corruption of a system to defeat you. But instead, what he does is he uses it to make you. Basically, he wants you to learn how to trust him, to be your deliverer. I mean, I think of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. How they're there under a foreign system that tried to impose laws upon them to begin to give honor to a God that was no God. And they didn't come up with the attitude, well, if you can't beat them, join them. They didn't do that. They didn't resort to violence or anything like that. But instead, they just continued to trust in God. And because they trusted in God, God delivered him. He delivered Daniel from the lion's den. He delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from a fiery furnace. And just like he delivered them, He can deliver you from anything, and he can deliver you from anyone. Now Isaiah, in our text, poses a question, already knowing the answer. He asked, what will you do on that day when disaster, desolation, when ruin comes? What will you do on that day? What will you do when everything comes crumbling down? That's a good question. I can testify to the fact that at different points in our lives, things will come crumbling down. That's right. Things will fall down. No one's exempt. Businesses, jobs, careers, relationships, marriages, even your health. And that's because these things are all temporary. Temporary things can crumble. Now, just because something crumbles doesn't always mean it's because you did something wrong. Don't let anyone tell you that. We learn from books like Job and Ecclesiastes in the Bible that it rains on the just and the unjust. That's right. Job's friends, they were thinking, well, you're experiencing this because you did something wrong. But God corrected them in the end of his presentation and had Job to pray for them. It's not always because you've done something wrong that things crumble. But when they do, trust God. Now, here in Isaiah is asking the guilty policymakers, who are you going to run to for help? Now remember, they're guilty. Who are you going to run to for help? What king are you going to ask for assistance? What king will you ally yourself to? What army are you going to pay to help you escape? I mean, Isaiah is communicating to them just as you disadvantage others and they had no one to help. Now you're going to understand just how they felt. This reminds me of the story of a billionaire by the name of Epstein in West Palm Beach. This man was guilty of seducing underage girls. For a brief time, he was able to use his money. He was able to use his power, use his influence to influence the system toward leniency on his behalf. But you know what? His day of reckoning came. His day of reckoning came and it all came crumbling down. Isaiah asked these guilty rulers, where will you leave your riches? In other words, was it worth it? I can answer that. Obtaining power and riches through corruption is never worth it. Sooner or later, you'll have to leave it behind. The reason is that sooner or later, there's going to be a day of reckoning. I mean, he told these wicked politicians that they're going to cringe among the captors or fall among the slain. Now that was true for the Israelite rulers who were being addressed. But it continues to be true even when you begin to look through history. Hitler committed suicide in a Berlin bunker. Mussolini and his mistress were stopped, taken hostage, shot. Their bodies were hung upside down while people who were passing by spit on their bodies, pelted them with rocks. I'm not going to continue on that note because it doesn't always end that way. Sometimes some may make it to an end of life situation. Even Jesus spoke of a man that God called a fool. God says, "Thou fool, your soul will be required immediately." He also spoke of a rich man, some call him Dives, who wouldn't feed a poor man by the name of Lazarus. He wouldn't even give him the crumbs that fell off of his table. He lifted his eyes up in hell. In summary, ultimately God wants us to do good to all humanity. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, and Native American are all his children and are equal in his sight. Leadership and political systems are empowered and designed by God to maintain order and morality, that'll provide relief for a people and not provoke rebellion from a people. So those who hold position, power, and shape policy, as well as those who execute and enforce it, they're all ordained by God for the well-being of His people. But according to this passage, those who slant the system to pervert its integrity, and those who tilt the tables of injustice to prevent its impartiality, sooner or later, they'll have a day of reckoning. Now, I know it's not popular to preach the severity of God, but we need to know that God is not only loving and full of grace. We need to understand that God is just. The prophet Hosea used the simile of a lion to describe the activity of God in relation to His reckoning. He says in Hosea the 5th chapter in verse 14, "For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, like a great lion to Judah. I will tear them into pieces and go away. I'll carry them off and no one will rescue them." There's no one for them to run to except for God. You see, sometimes He crushes in order to recycle. See, look at verse 15. "Then I will return to my lair until they have borne their guilt and seek my face. In their misery, they will earnestly seek me." So in all reality, God's heart is never to hurt His people. It's really only to heal His people. And we're healed when we learn how to trust in Him and walk in His way. So in view of the day of reckoning, perhaps we should run to Him now, so we won't have to run from Him later.